Blythe Brumleve is the founder of Digital Dispatch and the host of the Everything is Logistics podcast. With over a decade of experience in logistics and media, Blythe has a wealth of insights to share on how individuals can establish their own brand to drive business growth and marketing success. We'll explore how Blythe's unique career path, from executive assistant to successful podcaster and entrepreneur, was shaped by key mentors who encouraged her to pursue her passions. She'll reveal how early ventures in sports and entertainment media unexpectedly led her back to logistics, and how she's now helping logistics companies revamp their online presence through her web design and management services. Blythe will also discuss the power of podcasting and social media to break down silos in the industry and why adopting a curiosity mindset is essential for success. She'll share her own journey to 100,000 plus podcast downloads and growing a loyal YouTube following by embracing authenticity and continuous learning. So whether you're looking to build your own personal brand in logistics or just want to hear an inspiring story of entrepreneurship and following your instincts, this episode has something for you. Get ready to take notes as Blythe Brumleve shares her secrets to success in logistics and beyond. As always, if you find value from this episode, please like and subscribe. And now here's my conversation with Blythe Brumleve. Enjoy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Beyond Fulfillment Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Goulis, and this week, my guest is the founder of Digital Dispatch and the host of Everything is Logistics, the podcast, Blythe Brumleve. Welcome, Blythe.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. If you could, for everyone, for those that might not know you, could you just walk us through your backstory and of logistics and podcasting and up to where you are now?
Sure. So I got my start in logistics about 15 years ago, and I got started as an executive assistant working at an asset-based 3PL here in Jacksonville, Florida. I worked for them for a couple of years, and then I had a side hustle sports and entertainment blog. And when my boss found out about it, this was like early, like 2009, like very early, like social media days. And so when my boss found out what I was doing on the side, and instead of telling me to stop it or, don't work on it, he encouraged me and invested in me. And then was also fortunate enough to just hand over, or I guess, unfortunate at the time, but also fortunate, basically threw me into the fire of here, learn logistics marketing and do our website and do all of our inbound marketing for our company. So that's how it was sort of a trial by fire, getting used to what logistics marketing is and what it's evolved into. And so that's how I got my start in that realm. Unfortunately, that business did close after about 5 years operating. It was a tough market at the time, and there was, a bunch of situations that were going on that affected and ultimately forced the business to close. And so when it closed, I then moved on, and it was kind of like that time period of, do I stay in logistics or do I go and pursue media? And I chose to go and pursue media. And so here locally in the Jacksonville market, I became editor-in-chief of a local magazine. I started doing local radio, local TV. But if you work in any kind of like local news capacity, you kind of know that the money isn't exactly all there. You're working a ton of hours, you're doing a ton of work. And so I really did it for a while just to gain that extra experience. And that extra experience is what has led me into the role that I have today. Because I would eventually go back and work for my boss my old boss who had started up a new logistics company. So I went back and worked for him for a little while. And then he said, all right, I've it's time for me to push you out of the nest because there's no more room left for you to grow here. So I went out on my own. I founded Brumleve Brands, and they became my first customer, which was great. And underneath the Brumleve Brands umbrella is Digital Dispatch, the podcast, and a couple of other projects that I'm working on.
Okay. Wow. So that's quite a bit of serendipity there to kind of lead you where you are. So when you started your career, did you know what you wanted to do?
No, I had no idea. I think for my high school time frame, I had always known I wanted to run a business. And so when I was in high school, I was really focused, head down focused on trying to get my grades up, get volunteer hours, things like that, so that I could get as many scholarships as I could, because my parents told me at an early age, we can't afford college. You're going to have to pay for this yourself. And this was back in the days when, college was really the only option. Nowadays, you kind of have, it's kind of accepted that, not everybody has to go to college in order to be successful. But back then, it really was thought of as your only pathway to success. And so I earned a ton of scholarships, got a full ride, to go to school. And then when I was in school, I just realized how quickly I wasn't working on the things that I wanted to work on. I thought I would be able to immediately start, learning how to run a business and learning what is important in with the aspect of running a business. And it just felt like 13th and 14th grade. So I got really frustrated. So I ended up quitting college. And then I started taking nighttime classes here locally that were free, called JSEB. It's called Jacksonville Small and Emerging Business Program, where they teach you how to run a business and then also how to do business with the government, with the local city government contracts and things like that. So that's really where, I guess my career kind of evolved, is that, I thought I had a set pathway. And then when I got there, it just wasn't what I expected. And so I very quickly, within like a year and a half of going to school, decided this is not for me. I know what I want to do. And so I quit school and went and, took business classes instead.
Wow. Wow. Awesome. Yeah, because I noticed that too, because I have teenagers and there's so much pressure, it seems like, from the system to kind of get it all, figured out. What are you going to major in? Where are you going to go to college? And they kind of push them in there. And I've kind of like said, hey, you don't have to have it all figured out at 18 and, experiment, try some things, right? That's kind of the advice I give. But it sounds like you just innately knew, even though you kind of followed the recommended path, once you saw it wasn't for you, you just said, no, I'm going to follow my instincts and figure it out a different way.
Yes. So it's definitely, from a schooling perspective, I was right in that regard looking back. Now, I do think school is important, for things like if you want to be a doctor or a lawyer, things like that. But for what I just knew from an early age that I was going to be a business owner. And I was very frustrated that I wasn't taking anything related to owning a business. And I didn't feel like I was progressing in that regard. Now, I have started a bunch of random businesses. So I think I kind of learned that way, businesses that are no longer operational, and probably never should have been. But it put me on the pathway that I am here today. And so one of those businesses was like a cleaning business. And I tried to clean houses and start up a cleaning business for, I think, about 6 months. But just the back pain was so terrible that I couldn't take it. And so I was like, I got to figure out something else. If I'm in my mid-20s and I can't take, I'm having severe back pain, then this is probably not going to be a good career longevity wise.
Okay. So now when you were early on in logistics too, and you got your start and you had the side hustle, and then when your employer found out, and like you said, not only was he, not upset or anything, but also he encouraged it, and then it opened up a whole lot of opportunity to where he invested in you. He eventually became a client. Like what was that like? Like, you know what I mean? Like starting that side hustle and then getting that extra, motivation and push and having it turn into, a whole different direction.
I give full credit to my old boss, Al Steele, who has run a slew of transportation companies and has built them up. He was pretty much exhibit A of, a blue collar worker, kind of turning into an executive. He was a former truck driver who worked his way up in the company and then eventually earned enough income to where he could buy out the company. And then he became CEO of the company, sold that company off to, a big firm overseas. And, he was just really like the blueprint of I guess sort of the career model that I wanted to follow. That, I didn't even know that, transportation and logistics was a job until I got hired for this role. And the only reason I even applied to that role was because I wasn't going to be stuck at a computer all day. That was not a job that I wanted to have whatsoever. And, sort of here I am today. But it was one of those learning experiences to have somebody that saw I remember having to hide that I was a business owner when I was like waiting tables and things like that. That my bosses didn't like that there when I was a simple job like waiting tables. But here I am at a corporate environment, and my boss was incredibly supportive of it, and in fact invested in me to where he would send me to HubSpot conferences, additional training to learn, Adobe Suites, Microsoft Word, not Word, but Microsoft applications, graphic design, web design, things like that, that were all going to be beneficial to the company I was working for his company. But he also knew that these were things that I was interested in. And so it meant the world to me that he was a supporter from the very early days and is still a client to this day, still, a very strong supporter of mine. I talk to him regularly, and it's awesome to kind of have the dynamic that we have now with where I was. I was a waitress when he invested in me, and I kind of feel like he saw a lot of himself in me as well, with being a truck driver and then working his way up to own multiple multi-million dollar logistics operations.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. And so then when you pivoted into media, is that ever something you saw yourself doing
No.
prior?
No, I do remember because I was a senior in high school when 9/11 happened. And that was sort of a little life altering for, obviously for the nation. But I think for me in that pivotal year where I had mentioned before that, I've always been interested in, or I've always wanted to be a business owner. But I think watching the media coverage during that time frame, and I don't think I've ever told this story before, but I used to watch, I mean, just night and day news. I was obsessed with the news, obsessed with what was going on. I wanted to understand it. And I did kind of see a role for me, but always behind the camera, never in front of the camera, because I thought that you had to go to school for that. I thought you had to go to broadcasting school, journalism school, get a degree for that. I didn't know that that would be a career option until really social media came around, podcasting came around, YouTube. And so, I was kind of just I would say gifted these roles, kind of right place, right time. Even the radio gig that I had in Jacksonville for 5 years, it wasn't something that I tried out for. It was something that was offered to me because I had been writing about that topic for so long that the local radio station found out about me, gave me an audition, and then said, "Hey, do you want to talk about the Jaguars, once a week for, 6 months?" And I said, "Yes, heck yes, I'll sign me up." And then after 6 months, they were like, "Okay, now, we're willing to pay you now." And I think that was almost, I think unpaid internships are kind of looked down on nowadays, but I was fully invested, and they were taking a chance on me. And so I wanted to invest my time back into these different people and companies that were willing to take a chance on me. And so I felt an obligation to learn as much as I could about the craft and become as good as I can. I was a little unpolished, still kind of am, but I think it's part of the charm, and I think it's part of, why people like listening to or watching and reading the content that I create, is that, I write how I speak. How I am right here in this interview is exactly how I am, in a normal conversation or at conferences. So I think people resonate with authenticity. I think that word is kind of thrown around a lot, but I think people crave it. And that's what I've always tried to portray. And I think if I went to school and did the traditional broadcasting and journalism route, then I would have a very different tone as to, the content that I would be creating today.
Now that's very interesting too, because I watched a lot of your podcast and YouTube videos, and you have a phenomenal YouTube channel, very very good stats and whatnot. But you just seem like such a natural on camera. So is that because like once you got into this, that you really just put in a lot of extra work to be the best you could be?
I watched other people like a hawk. Like I listened to other, sports broadcasters in particular, especially someone like Dan Patrick, who I have listened to and looked up to for years. He kind of paved the way as far as podcasting goes, especially independent media coverage goes. He was for folks who don't know, he was at ESPN for, I think, for over 20 years. And then he was let go and he wasn't exactly happy about that situation. So he started up his own show in, I think, the attic of his house. And he had his, his Danettes, which is his, 3 or 4 guys that are helping him out with the, prep for the show and be their producers and things like that. So I have studied him for years because I think that that was the model that I was always trying to just emulate, especially the way that he interviews guests. Where I love the way that he starts off interviews. He doesn't typically start off interviews, even to this day, like how I start interviews, where I ask about people's backstory, because I think you kind of do have to do that level setting for most of the audience, because most of the audience hasn't heard from a lot of, leaders or subject matter experts in our field. But in the sports world, or, in his world, you've likely heard of, that athlete or that movie star that's coming on his show. So he doesn't have to do those, sort of, tell us about your career background before the conversation ever gets started. He always opens with a really interesting question. And that's something that I've, tried to emulate through the years, and I'm trying to emulate in logistics, but I just don't think the industry is there yet as far as like a knowledge perspective, that you still need to do that level setting of who this person is, the company that they're coming from, and why what they're going to say is important. Maybe we'll get there one day where we don't necessarily have to do those kinds of introductions. Not to say that they're a bad thing, but I've just always admired the way that Dan Patrick approaches interviews, and I've studied the way that he asks questions and the tone that he asks them in. And he's always dropping gems in his show about, what the press should be asking and when and why. And, I just, it's like a sponge, and, with watching him and other, broadcasters that I respect. And so I just tried to emulate what draws me into those conversations. And then I try to do that the same with my audience.
Attention manufacturers and e-commerce sellers. Is fulfillment a headache for you? Whether you're fulfilling in-house and you know you need to outsource, or you're with another 3PL and you know you deserve better service, Easy DC 3PL can help. We offer personal service, fast response time, and we're flexible to meet your unique needs. Get in touch today and find out how we can help you. And that brings up another really interesting point. So in logistics specifically, like I would say you epitomize personal branding in terms of all the stuff that you're doing and whatnot. And, obviously you've seen the industry come a long way through the course of your career, but like today in 2024, how important do you think it is for people in logistics to have a personal brand in terms of growing their business or selling or whatever they're doing?
I think it's vital. I think it's vital to organizations to support it, to encourage it, because we know with social media that the personal page of your employees is going to have a tremendous amount more of reach than your company page. And so for a lot of these companies, historically, they've been very nervous about letting their employees post on social media about their role, about their job, about, the struggles that their customers are facing, and, solutions that the company provides. They want it to go through legal, they want it to go through PR. They want to have all of these different hoops to jump through. But some of the more successful companies that we see in logistics are allowing their employees and encouraging them to take that subject matter expertise and share it with the world. Because if you take that approach, people do business with people. We all know this, and you probably heard that phrase 1,000 times, but it's worth repeating, that if people become aware of you and become aware of the things that you talk about, they develop an affinity towards you, and then over time they learn more about you, they learn more about what you like, what you dislike, the services that you provide, and then you're introducing them slowly and turning them into a warm lead. And so then that way, when they're ready to do business with you, because 95% of people are not in an active buying cycle, but when that 95%, or when a portion of that 95% enters that 5% that's ready to buy, and they know about you and the services that you provide or that your company provides, they're going to think of you first, and you will win versus your competitors, versus someone that goes to Google search. So I am a huge fan and a huge advocate of companies and employees promoting themselves, but in a way that makes sense to their audience. Because, internet users are selfish. They want to see things that entertain themselves. They want to see things that they're going to learn from, that they're going to laugh from. And so, are you going to be the one to provide it to them, or are you going to let somebody else provide it to them? And so that's sort of my ethos, my philosophy of how I think about personal branding. And the only reason I feel so strongly about this is because I come from a place that I could not afford a marketing agency. So I had to learn how to, build up my own personal brand, build up a website, build up different personas, not personas, I guess, build up different profiles on different channels, because you can't exactly talk the same on Twitter/X as you do on LinkedIn. You can't exactly talk the same on Facebook as you do Twitter. And so there's all these different sort of vernaculars and I guess things that come into play with the channel that you're actively publishing on. And so I'm a big fan of, supporting that from an organizational perspective. I mean, obviously with, a little bit of constraints, you don't really want to get into the world of politics or religion, just because that's, do it on your own time. Your own personal profile is probably not associated with your work. That's really the only caveat that I would advise, companies to have. But to allow them the flexibility and the encouragement to talk about the services and solutions that they think about, that they provide, is highly, highly beneficial. There are tons of companies that have adopted this method in logistics. Finally, after 10 years, it feels like, of struggling to get companies to recognize this, they have finally started adopting these different strategies, and I think it's paying off in dividends.
Yeah, and that's such a great point too, is like particularly I've noticed in logistics, because I'm relatively new in the field, is sales cycle is often can be longer than you expect. And people, it's not where you just call them and they're ready to buy. They're ready to buy on their own timetable. So if they really have to find you versus you always kind of reaching out, whether it's cold calling or other forms of prospecting too. So yeah, I agree completely. The personal brand is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, I think it's so vital in today's world, especially when, folks are also starting to become a lot more aware and weary of, sort of AI driven content and what's real and what's not. Also reviews are largely gamified online as well. And so there's a lot of distrust in a lot of legacy media and a lot of the things that we see online, but there isn't that. The trust that you have built up from a personal brand perspective is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, forms of marketing in today's world. I think it's absolutely vital that companies and subject matter experts within those companies adopt these methods ASAP.
Agreed. Okay, and you're perhaps best known for your podcast, Everything is Logistics. What made you decide to start a podcast?
So I mentioned that I had worked in local radio, and when I worked in local radio, I wanted to. The podcasting had just kind of started to come to the surface. I think it's safe to say that a lot of local media across the country is a little slow to adopt new mediums, and this is, I mean, keep in mind this is like more than 10 years ago. And so I said I want to start a podcast, and I want to use our radio show that we are creating each week, and I want to add it to a podcast. And their first question was, well, what's a podcast? And I said, oh no, that's, I'm gonna have to, and so I tried to explain it to them. It just wasn't something that, safe to say that, a lot of these folks that are working at radio stations and want to add something else to their plate, much less something that they didn't fully understand. And so the way I kind of got around this was said, well, why don't you give me a copy of the show file? And then when you give me a copy of the show file, I'll take care of it. I'll upload it to a podcast player. So that's exactly what I did. And I got started with that sports and entertainment podcast, and I did that for years. And that was sort of my personal outlet where I wanted to create more content in addition to the one show a week that I was already doing. And so I used the podcast as sort of my creative outlet. And then when I decided to go out on my own and start my business, I said, well, a sports and entertainment podcast just it isn't going to mesh well with a B2B audience. And so I started up the Digital Dispatch podcast. And when I started up that podcast, I used it as a way to talk to my target audience, to talk to my target customers, to understand where they were coming from, what problems that they were dealing with, and things like that. And then the podcast ended up doing really well, and I did it for a few months before it caught or before FreightWaves noticed it, and so FreightWaves said, "Well, why don't you come, do the same show you're already doing, but just do it for us." And so I did that. I created a show called Cyberly, pretty much the exact same show, except for I had help again, which was nice, having a producer and having editors and things that I was used to at the radio station that you don't necessarily have when you're podcasting solo. So I did that show Cyberly for a couple of years with FreightWaves, which was fantastic. And then at the end of my contract in 2022, my contract ended November 1st. And then by January 1st of 2023, I had started Everything is Logistics. And so just changed the name from the Digital Dispatch podcast over to Everything is Logistics. And so that's where the podcast was born. And so we have close to, I think, 400 episodes. It hit 100,000 downloads last year, starting to grow the YouTube channel a bit. And then we're all over social media. So it's really been and sponsor supported as well. And so that's been a huge benefit, is to allow me the flexibility to say, okay, I don't necessarily have to worry about, developing 5 websites in a week anymore. I can focus more on quality instead of quantity. And then I can also take that same approach with the podcast, where I'm focused on quality shows instead of quantity. And I can talk to, leaders like yourself. You came on the show, and, we're able to go in deep and in depth with a lot of different topics in the logistics world, where I think a lot of folks incorrectly assume that, there's only so much you can talk about in logistics, but we are barely scratching the surface. There's so much to talk about in this industry, from a historical perspective, from an evergreen perspective, from a breaking news perspective. Even the whole world now really knows, a lot about supply chain ever since, the Ever Given was stuck in the Suez Canal. I have a grandmother asking me about, supply chain and logistics now. What's going on with the ports, and how do we fix it? And, things like that. And so it's become a little bit mainstream, which is really cool to see. I still have to explain what I do for a living, though, to my family and friends. And so I don't think that they quite understand it just yet, but they know the supply chain and logistics vernacular now, but they don't know the intricacies, which means, content wise, we have a lot more room to grow in that regard.
Okay. Wow. So you've been podcasting for like 10 years?
Yep.
So,
A little over 10 years now.
wow. Okay. And obviously ton of episodes, ton of content. What do you think's the biggest benefit of doing that many podcasts and being in the industry that long?
Oh, good question. I would say learning from smart people. I am blessed to be able to, take some of the smartest minds in this industry and get, an hour of their time and ask them really any question that I can think of. And I can learn from the smartest people in this industry. That is the number one reason why I do the show. Joe Lynch, who is the host of the Logistics of Logistics, he's a podcaster that I have deep admiration and respect for. But he has said before that he would do his show even if no one listened. And I feel the exact same way, that if no one listened to my show, I would still do it, just because of the valuable insights that I learn from the people that I get to talk to. So that is far and away the biggest advantage, that I think that any company, if you start a podcast right now, if you interview your customers, if you interview even the workers within your organization or other subject matter experts, within your sort of, logistics silo, that you are going to learn so much. And speaking of silos, that's exactly why, I started up the show, Everything is Logistics, is so I could learn more about the different silos, because I had no idea about anything outside of an asset-based 3PL. I thought that that was sort of the logistics world that I was always going to live in. And now I get to learn about maritime, I get to learn about warehousing, I get to learn about robotics, all, even the intricacies within trucking between drayage and LTL. There's so many things to still learn, and it's constantly being updated. And with the influx of technology into this space as well, it's just there's so much opportunity to continue breaking down those silos, and not just from a technology perspective, but also from an informational perspective, because there's people that work in warehousing that have no idea how, trucking works, or there's people that work in trucking that have no idea, how a 3PL executive is thinking. Maybe they don't care, but it could be, a situation where the folks that are willing to learn, about these different silos, it's only to your benefit and to your advantage. Being a lifelong sort of sponge, and adopting the curiosity mindset, I think has served me well. And I would encourage anyone else to sort of adopt that same lifestyle.
Yeah, that's so true, right? Because particularly in logistics, so many of these different parts of the supply chain need to interact, partner, just depending on every deal is different, right? So, like you said, having that knowledge and then having those connections too, because so often I'll need a referral, whether it's for freight forwarding or any other aspect of what a deal may require. And it's through my podcast or just through other connections too. Same thing. You get to meet people, you get to know people and understand kind of how those different parts of the supply chain work.
100%.
Okay, so we're midway through 2024. What's next for you? What do you have planned as far as like content coming out or products being released? Anything you can tell us about?
So I am working on a new business right now. I can't really talk about it just yet because I don't have the MVP ready, but I should have something, a little bit later in the fall to announce on that regard. But I did just launch. We've been talking a lot about, sort of founder-driven marketing, and so I did just launch a template and a video course, very short. You can watch it in less than an hour, but basically the entire sort of content distribution interview system that I use, but really your content supply chain. So the exact same system that I use, the templates that I use, I put it up for sale up on digitaldispatch.io. And so if folks want to check that out, you can know the exact blueprint of the sort of the behind the scenes of how we make content and how we distribute it out to our audience. And so just launched that. But other than that, I'm getting married in October, and so between all of these different things that are going on, just trying to keep on swimming and not to get a little crazy with taking on too much responsibility during a time that I probably shouldn't be. But yeah, those are the big focuses. So we got the podcast, Digital Dispatch, of course, and then that new project that I mentioned that I'll have more information on that later in the fall.
Okay, and just real quick for everyone, tell us about Digital Dispatch and what you do in terms of for like the websites for logistics companies.
Sure. So we build websites in weeks, not months. And so we focus only on the supply chain and logistics industry. And so you don't have to spend a whole heck of a lot of time, explaining to your marketing agency on, what a reefer carrier is, or what, warehouse robotics, or, anything like that. You don't have to explain that to us. We build, very short and to the point websites. I think for a lot of marketing agencies, they tend to charge a lot and they tend to overcomplicate the process. And I tend to think that in today's sort of short term attention span, You really need to have just a handful of pages that get right to the point, that speak right to your customer. And so we focus on that, and also website management. That is the primary focus of Digital Dispatch, is managing your website. So it's not just launching it and then we just say, a lot of agencies will be like, okay, good luck, sayonara. But for us, we help you grow from that marketing perspective. So I'm constantly tweaking, I'm constantly adjusting, social media integrations, APIs, different kind of content strategies on my sites. And then whatever I learn, I offer that up to my clients. And so we handle all of your WordPress updates. That's the platform that we primarily work on. And then we help your business grow as you grow. And so majority of companies are really going to be fine with just a handful of pages on a website. And then if you find the time to start creating content and then, start expanding your business, then that's where, we would also help you grow in that regard as well. So it's website design and development, very affordable cost. We can launch you in weeks, not months, and then we handle that website, manage it for you so that you can focus on what you do best.
Excellent. Okay. And Blythe, if people want to get in touch with you and find out more about what you do, what's the best way they can do that?
So you can see all of the projects that I'm working on over at brumlevebrands.com. That's the umbrella company that I had mentioned earlier. And it's BRUMLEVE, so brumlevebrands.com. And then the podcast is over at everythingislogistics.com.
All right. And we'll link all that in the show notes for everyone. Okay. Well, Blythe, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate the time. And that is all the time we have for now. We will see you next time.